Looks like everyone's getting settled here. Looks like we're getting food. We're getting a drum so we can speak to our ancestors. It's really important that we speak to our people who came before us. I really believe that. I really know that in my heart. I think about the people who walked this land. I think about those women warriors who held off all of the abuse. Because in Native country, if you are a healer, if you are a warrior, a protector of the ones who cannot stand to protect themselves, or if you are what we call hiwak, spiritual house leader, whoever you are, it's not a gender designation. That's the belief. That's the knowing. That's why we're here today. Because we know this. We know this in our hearts. And our ancient people have always practiced that. They've always known that. And so that is called a spiritual designation. Because each and every one of us has a spiritual designation. The Spirit brought us to this place, to our Chachatangach, our Sacred Mother, today in our lifetimes for a reason. It was no mistake. There are no mistakes or accidents in Native country. We're all here for a reason on our Mother Earth. And so the sooner we recognize that, the sooner we get in touch with that, then we can do the work that we're intended to do. And so I'm always really very, very happy to see people doing the work, that they were able to hear the voice of Spirit, that they were able to respond to that voice and that calling. Or maybe it was an elder that kind of moved them in that direction, because that's how we did it in the old days. And that's what we're rebirthing, is that whole idea that we can discover very early on who we are spiritually. And I'm very thankful for this day. I raise my hands to each and every one of you. Siem Nishtelacha. Haishka Siem Nishtelacha. Geno ait quenchquelaquence, atia tanget siem. Geno ait quenchquelaquence. Ias and Techel Swahela. Ias and Techel Swahela. It's good to see everybody. I have a good feeling in my heart on this evening. Chiokten Sinisnat. Asa Chiokten. Chalayet Sin Husseinich. Leia Tula. Vancouver Island, Canada. I am Chiokten, and I'm from Saanich Nation. And I support the Duwamish, the Duwamish, the Duwamish people in their struggle. I support these women of color here who are standing so strong for our future generations with so much wisdom and carrying such a strong torch for everybody. Because that's nothing new in these territories. It's something that's being reborn. And we need to understand that when the U.S. government had borrowed what they thought they were creating democracy, but they planted other seeds, sadly. But they borrowed it from the Iroquois nations and the Confederacy over there on the East Coast. But the one thing they left out one extremely important aspect, and that is this right here. And that this is our elders. I want to see some women elders right here. They left this out right here. They left this out right here. They left this out right here. They left it out because as patriarchs, as men, it was men from a place that had destroyed the women wisdom keepers and the connection to the earth. And so we're rebirthing that. And inside of the original democracy of the Iroquois nations and all of Native America are the Council of Grandmothers. And that is at the very top tier. Beyond the chieftain, a lot of people don't even know what a chieftain is. Can anyone tell me what a chieftain is in Native country? Anyone know, like, the best definition of a chieftain? In Coast Salish, I know more about our territory. They are wisdom keepers. So somebody had the answer. They just I didn't quite see their hand. And so wisdom keeper. You've got a wisdom keeper at the top, right near the top, because they're a spiritual house leader and they're carrying great wisdom and they're honored for that wisdom. So they almost always listen to that word. Beyond that is the Council of Grandmothers, the last word to be spoken, the last voices to be heard in any decision making that affects the people. A Council of Grandmothers. I ask you to remember that, CM, my honorable friends. I ask you to think about that and contemplate that and think about how we could bring that to this world, because that is missing in a big way. That sacred feminine is missing. And those grandmothers, the idea of an elder who carries wisdom in the deepest way. So I thank you, my friends and family. I thank the Duwamish people. I raise my hands to them for taking care of this land for so long, the lands and waters, that we have a place to live here today, that we can walk upon the bones of their ancestors. My prayer is that we learn how to walk upon the bones of their ancestors as gently as they did. And you know what? Those bones are in everything that you touch. Their DNA is in every single, it's in these, if this wood came from this land, the DNA of their ancestors are in this cedar. So I ask you to think about that and think about your life and think about how we can share these ideas of respect and acknowledgement of all the gifts around us. And I think I'm done talking. I was going to go ahead and sing a song. I think I will real quick just to honor our ancestors. We have a second. Okay, let's do that. And I don't need a mic for that. We're going to go ahead and sing a song. And if everyone could stand, whoever's able to stand. And in this song, let's just go ahead and raise our hands. That's a show of gratitude. Let's think about the gifts that we have in our lives. Let's think about our leaders. Let's think about those grandmothers. Let's think about returning the circle of life to children. Let's think about returning the Council of Grandmothers to our leadership of our world, so that because they hold the key to the circle of life. They are the life bringers, and they should be at the top decision-making tier of this country here where we live, if we're going to have justice and harmony.
Oh Thank you, Chair Ketan.
Hi everyone, my name is Alex Chuang. I'm a senior from Youth of Color Speak Out at Garfield High School. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say that Women of Color Speak Out has changed my entire life. I had a pretty typical mainstream environmentalist path at the beginning of high school, and I had a lot of motivation and a lot of ideas, but meeting Women of Color Speak Out is what pushed me over the edge of understanding how the world really works and understanding how we're actually going to change things. And so basically I knew about systems of oppression and I was aware of all that stuff, but thanks to Seattle Public Schools, I did not understand and no one had taught me how ingrained they are in our system. No one had made the connection between history, between systems of oppression and today. And no one had talked about the intersectionality between systems of oppression. And so I had to learn that from this presentation that you're about to see and talking to these women. And the more that I learned, the more dots connected in my mind between the problems and the consequences of the world. And I realized that the source of the problems of climate change is not apathy, it is the system, it's all these systems of oppression. And so that was big, and it made me think about, well, how are we gonna solve them? Well, it's to break down the system. Yeah. And so, yeah, I see the world a lot more critically and analytically now, which is sad, but very useful. And so my mind has changed from valuing the environmental sciences and the death of animals and the earth to prioritizing the impact of climate change on people, and which is something that's happening right now and has been happening for so long. And now I'm always wondering why people are constantly like screaming about animals when they're not talking about the people that are dying literally right now. And so what this presentation is about is that we absolutely cannot solve climate change or combat it without combating all systems of oppression. And so this is a movement that is intersectional with all other social justice movements, and that's because all people are impacted by climate change. And so some things that I learned recently are, and this is kind of a quote from Zarna, "The establishment will not save you, never wait for anyone to save you, you save yourself." The government will not save you, because going through the government and going through the establishment is too slow. We're running out of time. We've already run out of time. And so the entire system is oppressive. You can't fight climate change if you work within the system. You can't use the government. You can't use prisons, banks, cops, corporations. You have to solve the problem at its source. And so there's a lot of BS that's happening right now, like carbon tax and all of these things that they say they're green, but they're really working under the framework of capitalism, and that inherently is not sustainable. And so this is why we have to have radical systems change and regrowth, building communities from the ground up. And that means using guidance and wisdom from Indigenous people, from communities and youth that have been suffering and that are suffering right now. And lastly, I'd like to say that Women of Color Speak Out are some of the warmest, most passionate, brave, and wise people that I've ever known. And every time I talk to them, I learn so much I don't even understand. And the best part of it is that they're all so completely filled with love, like 100%. And all of their criticism and when they call people out and when they're being really harsh and their social justice all comes from love. And so I'd like to thank them for being really inspiring and powerful and a role model to me and to the community. So without further ado, Women of Color Speak Out.
Thank you, Alex, for those beautiful words. We're so proud to have started off Youth of Color Speak Out, and we hope many more to come. So thank you all for being here. Welcome. We always open our spaces thanking the guardians and caretakers of the land, and we're so grateful to actually be in the Longhouse and the people of the Duwamish today. This space is so precious. I'm full of gratitude just to be here. We stand in solidarity with Indigenous people. We support them. We want to learn from them to live in harmony with the land like they have for centuries. So where women of color speak out, we started last year during Shell No, when we were doing direct action after direct action. We were in these spaces, and we were looking around and seeing that there weren't a lot of people of color in the movement, and we wanted to change that. And we decided to change that by creating a space for us to speak out, and a space for the movement to grow with the perspective and analysis that we have. We want this movement to not just be the mainstream movement that we see around the country, but one that is aware and conscious with a racial justice and a climate justice analysis. So that's when we started last year and have done this presentation that you're about to see, Climate Change and the Systems of Oppression. We've done it numerous times now, and it continues to evolve. So we talk about colonialism, we talk about racism in the prison industrial complex, we talk about capitalism, we talk about patriarchy, then we connect all of this to climate change, and then we offer solutions. So it's a big, beautiful package. And we recognize that this crisis we're facing, this urgent, important, critical crisis of the climate crisis, is also an economic crisis, and that we cannot solve this crisis just by stopping fossil fuels. It's not enough to just deal with the superficial causes, but we have to go deeper into the root causes. And these systems of oppression are the root causes. And so the work that we do in this movement must come from doing this deeper work of dismantling the systems. Because if we just replace Shell with a big solar panel company, we're still gonna have these systems that oppress and exploit the world and people. And so this is why we have to do this work. So systems of oppression are institutionalized power that is historically formed and perpetuated, and we're so conditioned to them, and they're so deeply embedded that we often don't recognize them. We don't recognize them, we perpetuate them, and they even make us feel guilty. We feel bad about who we are, and we continue to perpetuate them. So when we talk about racism and we talk about patriarchy, it doesn't mean that we hate white people. When we talk about white supremacy here, and we will, it doesn't mean that we hate white people. When we talk about patriarchy, we don't mean that we don't want men to exist, right? That's not the point. So the truth is that we want to recognize these systems, and we want to encourage people to process them in a safe and healthy way. We want people to grow over them, and we want people to change how they perpetuate them so that we can actually move away from the system. Our intention for doing this presentation is to grow the movement in a way that matches the true solving of the crisis, and not just a superficial Band-Aid. So thank you all for being here. We are so grateful to have a room full of allies to grow with and work with and fight with, because that's what we're here for. Okay, so this is our disclaimer slide. So as we talk about these systems, you will feel uncomfortable, and that is a part of the process. This is a lot of work, and it does not happen overnight. So you will feel uncomfortable, and you may feel defensive, and that's okay. And also we want to give a trigger warning, because we talk about rape, we talk about violence, we talk about war, we talk about a lot of things that may cause discomfort, and so we just wanted to share that with you and give you a warning to look after yourself as you need to. And with that, we're going to jump into our first system of oppression with Zarna, and colonialism.
Thanks, Charles. Next slide. Okay, so I'm here to talk to you about colonialism and empire. What does it mean exactly? Next slide. So colonialism refers to control over a piece of land and its people by a more dominant power. Control over a piece of land and its people by a more dominant power. Next slide. This is a map of the world during the 18th century. And all of these different colors that you see here are different empires. So the bright red that you see in South America, North America, that's the Spanish Empire. The dark red in Canada and parts of Africa, India, Australia, that's the British Empire. The blue all over Africa and parts of North America, that's the French Empire. The green, that's the Portuguese Empire. The purple, that's the Russian Empire. right? The single unifying factor is that these were all European empires, right? In other words, the white people colonized the black and brown people all over the entire world. Next slide. This is the propaganda of empire. She's white. She's blonde. She's pretty. She's a mother. And she nurtures her colonies at her very breast. They adore her. They love her. They cannot do without her. They are literally attached to her breast. Next slide. This is the reality. Empire gorged itself on the blood and sweat and tears of the people that they colonized. They were not feeding their colonies. They were leeching the very blood out of them. Next slide. And this country was part of the British Empire, right? And this country fought a revolution against the British in order to be free of that empire. And then this country became the empire. And they became the empire using this term, manifest destiny, to overspread and possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government. In other words, we've got the best government idea in the whole world. No one has a better government idea than us because it gives us liberty. And therefore, that gives us the right to overspread and possess the whole of the continent because God gave it to us. And this idea came from white men, right? Next slide. This is the propaganda of manifest destiny. She's liberty. She's white. She's blonde. She's hot. She wears flowing white robes that barely cover her right breasts. No, she's flying over the continent. You see this? She's flying because she's free. Notice how she has power cables in her hand. Notice how there are coal trains behind her, following her. Notice how there are ships behind her, bringing goods from other countries, bringing slaves from other countries. Notice how beneath her there are white men in pioneer wagons. White men in pioneer wagons. This term pioneer, what it means is a white man going somewhere other white men have never been before. That's what that means. Because there were people who lived on this continent, many different peoples, and yet they were pushed further and further off the land, and their way of life and their cultures and their spiritualities and their entire systems were pushed further and further off the land. But remember, this idea came from white men, right? Next slide. Except that George Washington and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and all of these founding fathers met with the Iroquois natives frequently. Paul referenced this earlier. The Iroquois were a confederation of 6 tribes on the East Coast. And they met with these white men frequently. And they told them during the British Empire, they said to them, empire is evil. You need to get away from empire because you need to be free. And the only way you will be free is if you follow the great law of peace. Next slide. The great law of peace, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right of women to participate in government, separation of powers, checks and balances, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, 3 branches of government, and a women's council, which would settle disputes and legal violations. Other than the right of women to participate in government, the founding fathers adopted all of these things. The Women's Council, they put a bunch of old white men on there and called it the Supreme Court. The US Constitution is based upon the Iroquois Great Law of Peace. And the Iroquois political philosophy tells us that peace is the will of the Creator. And that's why Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal." Next slide. But you see, those white men were not following the great law of peace. They were not following those words, though they wrote them and claimed them as their own. They had slaves, and a slave was considered 3/5 of a person. All men are created equal, not in this empire. Next slide. And those native people, those indigenous peoples of this continent, who gave them the great law of peace, who gave them help to actually survive on this continent, those native peoples were forced off their lands and made to starve to death. And not only made to starve to death, but made to suffer horrific genocides and biological warfare and slaughter and massacre that we could never even imagine. It was so horrific. Because the prevailing view of the US Army was the only good Indians I ever saw were dead. General Philip Sheridan. Next slide. And it's not just in the past, because we are here in the Duwamish Longhouse. Seattle and King County is the traditional ancestral lands of the Duwamish people. And yet in 2015, the federal government denied this tribe federal recognition. In other words, they said, your tribe doesn't exist, and it never existed. Because if they had acknowledged them, they would have to acknowledge the treaty rights that Chief Sealth negotiated for his people. They have never honored those rights. Next slide. Colonizers take control of land and people. How do they do this? They do this by imposing their European culture of capitalism and materialism. To do this, they destroy indigenous cultures that protect the land. Spiritual beliefs, languages, family structures, relationships, so that only European culture is seen as acceptable. They abducted indigenous children and forced them into these boarding schools and called them pagans and called them heathens and forced their own religion upon them and forced their own language upon them and abused them in all manners of horrific ways. So that those children, if they managed to survive that horrific process, they would teach such broken values to their own children. And it gets worse and it gets worse and it gets worse. Next slide. And if, of course, if colonizers cannot destroy an indigenous idea, an indigenous culture, they co-opt it and say that it's their culture, such as the Great Law of Peace. This is a map of the British Empire during its height. Everything in red that you see here belonged to that tiny little island that you see in the center. And the reason why we see maps this way is because Europe was considered to be the center of the world. This is why we see maps like this. Next slide. So this is the continent of Africa during the height of the British Empire. Everything in red there belonged to the British and everything in blue belonged to the French. And actually, right there on the Horn of Africa, slightly inwards of the Horn, that is Ethiopia. Ethiopia was never colonized. This map is incorrect. This map is the British claiming something that they had never actually controlled. So I just wanted to point that out. But on the whole, this was how things were happening during the height. Next slide. This is the continent of Africa today. Shell, 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 BP, 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 Shell, 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 Shell. All of these logos that you see here, they are all logos of fossil fuel companies. And they are all British and French. Every single one of them. And even Ethiopia right here, yeah, there's a fossil fuel logo right there too. The continent of Africa is not free. Because what is colonialism? Control of land and people. Next slide. So it's not just Africa. They came right here to our waters with their giant Arctic drilling rig to take it up to the Arctic where brown people live so that they could colonize them too. Do you know what that Arctic drilling rig was called? The Polar Pioneer. They knew exactly what they were doing. Next slide. We fight wars to maintain the fossil fuel empire. Key war architect John Bolton, he said of the Middle East, it's a critical oil and natural gas producing region that we, the USA, fought so many wars to try and protect our economy from the adverse impact of losing that supply. Yeah, he admitted openly, these wars, it's all about oil. He admitted it openly. It is not a secret. Next slide. And yet, the mainstream environmental movement never mentions empire as a main cause of this planet's environmental problems. Why? Next slide. Well, I'll tell you why. World Wildlife Fund, well, they're well known, right? They're this giant NGO. They do so much work all over the entire world to protect different species. The World Wildlife Fund, right? That's a good thing. They're in bed with Monsanto and Big Oil. They've taken lots of their money. They have participated in the displacement and cultural destruction of 20 million indigenous people worldwide. The World Wildlife Fund had a private military commando unit that was deployed against African liberation movements. In other words, the black people who were fighting for their freedom, who were fighting to protect their people from colonizers, who were fighting to protect their resources from white colonizers. World Wildlife Fund deployed their mercenaries against them. Next slide. And guess what? It's much closer to home than that. The Sierra Club, which was founded in 1872, which was founded and helped to establish the national parks, right? Well, that's a really good thing. We needed to protect the natural places in this world, and we needed to do something serious to make that happen. Yeah, except that that's not what happened. What happened was the Sierra Club was formed to force indigenous people off their lands and create hunting playgrounds for rich white men. Yosemite National Park, that was the first of them. They called it conservation. And if you think that that was the past, in 2012, Sierra Club took $26 million of natural gas money while telling the public simultaneously that natural gas was a cleaner fossil fuel than coal and oil, and we should be moving towards natural gas. This is for real. Next slide. So what we see is the mainstream movement not helping us, but working against us. That's what we're seeing. Because we're talking about solar, and we need solar, right? We all agree we need solar, we need wind, we need geothermal, we need renewable energies. Except that where are the materials going to come from to make these solar panels? Where are they going to come from? They're going to be taken from colonized countries. And people are going to be colonized all over again so that those resources get stolen from them. India has an ambitious plan to power the entire nation with solar power. An ambitious plan, and they said we're going to make our own solar panels with our own resources. And the US government said, no, you can't. You're not allowed. You know why? Because the trade rules of NAFTA say you can't. You have to use our corporations. That is colonization all over again. We keep talking about green jobs, green jobs. I can't even tell you how many NGOs I've heard that will go on and on and on about it, except that all they're really talking about is corporate green jobs. Corporations are colonizing powers. When are we going to talk about green jobs that are community-based? When are we going to talk about green jobs that are local? When are we going to talk about green jobs that are actually good for the planet, such as hemp production, such as permaculture, such as earthship housing, such as radically sustainable building? When are we going to talk about those green jobs? So what we've seen is that the mainstream environmental movement are not helping us. They're not helping us. It is the grassroots that actually gets things done. But what we see is that the NGOs take credit for the work that the grassroots do. And then they send out emails, donate. That's what happened after Shell No. I'm on every single one of those email lists. I got countless emails from people I'd never even seen here. Next slide. Carbon War, their initiative is not going to help us. It is not climate justice. It is backwards. It is not revenue neutral. It is revenue negative. 1 billion over 4 years. We will be in the hole. Where's that money going to come from? It's going to come from poor people. It's going to come from people of color. It's going to come from women. Because their services will be cut. Exactly. There's no cap on emissions. And Carbon War are working with Republicans on this in order to weaken the grassroots work that was done by so many people to actually come up with a real, genuine carbon tax. Next slide. The non-profit industrial complex is the fossil fuel empire. It is. They are working with them against us. And that's why we have to understand that the revolution will not be funded. It will not be funded, and it will not be broadcast either. Next slide. This is a map of the people. So at the top here, this map, in all of the countries in red are the countries most responsible for climate change. All of the countries in blue right there are the countries least responsible. And down here at the bottom, all of the countries in blue at the top, in the global north, least impacted. And all of the countries at the bottom in red, in the global south, most impacted. In other words, the white colonizers have created climate change, and the brown and black people who were colonized are going to pay for it. Next slide. The Daily Mail is a British newspaper. It told its readers, go to these countries, right? These countries in yellow and orange and red, go to these countries in the global south before they're wiped out by climate change. Not to help them, not to stand in solidarity with them, not to be on the front lines with them. No, go to these countries to enjoy them before they're wiped out by climate change. Go see the animals before they go extinct. Go see the savannas before they're wastelands. Go eat the food that the people cook before the food and the people are gone. It is colonization all over again. Next slide. Because that is what this is. It is the white supremacist state. It is racism. It is colonialism. It is imperialism. It is Eurocentrism. If you do not understand that the climate justice movement is a racial justice movement, you don't understand what's going on. I'm going to hand it to Sarah.
So I'm going to start this off with an apology because I actually have to get going after this because my partner is graduating today. So I'm going to talk about the prison industrial complex. How many of y'all have heard of the prison industrial complex? A lot of people. Good. So essentially the prison industrial complex is we've turned prisons into this profiteering thing that instead of sending people to jail for crimes so that they can be rehabilitated, we're creating a new system of slavery. To start with, U.S. only has 5% of the world's population, and yet it contains 25% of the world's prison population, as well as 25% of the world's CO2 emissions. That means that we have more prisoners and pollution than per capita than anywhere else in the world. 1 in 3 Americans have a criminal record, but it didn't always used to be like this. The total incarcerated population in the U.S. is 2.4 million. That's a 500% increase over the past 30 years. Next slide. Go back. So you can begin to see that the spike starts with the war on drugs. So, but really, to understand where it started out, we have to go back to slavery. So at the end of slavery, we're all told that after the 13th Amendment, slavery ended, and yay, it was all great. That's not true. So you look in the 13th Amendment here, it ended slavery with one exception, unless you're a criminal. And so, given this loophole, they found all sorts of ways to criminalize blackness. First off, they didn't want to give us jobs, and then they said they put out vagrancy laws. And so vagrancy laws were basically that if you didn't have a job, you would go to jail. And so they didn't give black people jobs, then they put them in jail for not having a job, and then thanks to convict leasing, which we still have today, they could take the black people who were jailed for not having a job and rent them out back to the plantations they were freed from. And so this was called the Black Codes. And through convict leasing, prisoners were rented out. And one of the places they were rented out to a lot was also coal mines, one of the leading causes of pollution. And so this was the beginning, and it's catapulted into the system that we have today. So, Nixon was the first to declare a war on drugs, which is really a war on people of color. And he received the political power through a lot of propaganda. This was about the time when they started criminalizing weed. One of the things they said to criminalize weed was that that if white women smoked weed, they would sleep with black men. Oh, the horror! And so there was a bunch of propaganda put out so that he would be able to put out these laws to criminalize it. And then we have the Anti-Drug Abuse Act in 1986, which Reagan created. This actually created mandatory minimums and sentenced people found with 1 gram of crack 100 times worse than cocaine. The only difference between crack and cocaine is, besides some baking soda, is who's using it and where is it found, with cocaine being a rich white drug and crack being a poor black drug. This happened during the Nicaragua-Iran-Contra, where the government assisted or turned a blind eye to the drug cartels in Nicaragua who were smuggling cocaine into America via drug lords in inner cities. These laws and after have created this system that is the prison-industrial complex. The ending result is the disproportionate statistics where we have today, where 1 in 3 black men are in jail. We now have more black people in prison than we had slaves in the 19th century. This is the new prisonal system. So on top of that, the prisoner system is become a debtor system. In 24 states, including Washington State, they're legally allowed to charge you for room and board. So when you get out, you're burdened with a load of debt plus interest while in jail. And this hit pretty close to home when my partner's brother was getting out of jail, and he'd been in there for 8 years, and he had racked up over $150,000 worth of debt. And when he was asked how much he has to pay, they said, well, it doesn't matter because at the rate that they're, the interest, they're charging him $1,000 interest every month. They said, you're never going to pay this off. And so your punishment isn't over when your sentence is over. And that is actually why last week when I was in Watts, when I ran into Bill Clinton, I cussed him out. Because Clintons, they have significantly increased the prison industrial complex. And the damage they have done is still being felt. The 3 strikes you're out, yep, that's Clinton's legacy. On top of taking education out of prisons because he thought prisoners weren't worth that, while Hillary thinks we're super predators. And so if you have a felony, especially a drug offense, they don't even allow you to get financial aid when you get out of prison. Once you have that for life, you never get going to college unless you take the money out on your own. On top of that, when you get out of jail, you're not allowed public housing assistance, public food assistance, public health assistance, and a criminal record is the only thing that you can legally discriminate against you in employment and housing. So it's no wonder the recidivism or reoffense rates in this country after 5 years are about 77%. What are you supposed to do? They won't give you a job. They won't let you get housing. We're back in the same system that at the end of slavery. The only other, and so people are forced into the black markets or forced back into jail. So today, prisons are a huge source of profit, and some of that profit the Clintons have taken. So now they're privatized, hired by the state by out-of-state contracts. So you have these private prisons who get contracts from the state, and their contracts have quotas about how many beds they will have full. And since they're paid per bed, now we've given an incentive to this corporation to keep their beds full. And because it makes more money for these privatized prisons. This conflict of interest has led to much corruption, including wives of judges who are sentencing people who have been found to be invested in prisons. Recently, a Pennsylvania judge went to jail for a Kids for Cash scandal, where he was accepting money from the owner of a privatized juvie to sentence kids longer and harsher. This is a reality of this prisoner system that we have today. That's why the whole do the crime, do the time system doesn't work. Because as we can see with the rapist swimmer, people aren't all getting the same time. So class 2 prison labor is anything from stamps, license plates, furniture, and military equipment. Now, all state agencies, including the University of Washington, are required to buy from class 2 prison labor. That gives a monopoly on prisoner markets. And yet, Washington state law says prisoners are only paid on a gratuity scale. That's a tip. That's all they're paid. They're paid 42 cents an hour, minimum wage. Privatized prisons also pay their laborers even less sometimes than sweatshops, and so they monopolize the slave markets that the people in the global south can't even compete with, and then people in the global south are relegated to extraction markets because they can no longer compete with it in the slave markets. On top of that, these big companies are using slave labor, including Starbucks, Microsoft, Boeing, Victoria's Secrets. They all use prison labor. And have paid people pennies on the hour for work that would have been paid around $15 to $25 an hour. So what does this have to do with climate change? Well, climate change is bringing increased natural disasters, including wildfires and hurricanes. During these disasters, prisoners have no agency or no say in whether or not they will be evacuated. In fact, when we gave this lecture at a women's prison, they actually told us that they've been told the drill is, in the case of a fire, earthquake, or any other natural disasters, they go in their cell and get locked up, and all the staff leave. They are left there to die. And this is what we've seen during recent hurricanes, including Hurricane Rita, Sandy, Katrina. Prisoners were left in their cells while the rest of the city were evacuated. Prisoners are also given the most dangerous jobs, put on the front lines of firefighting and oil spill cleanup. Prisoners are paid around $3 an hour and not given the right training to fight fires, while firefighters are paid $20 to $35 an hour. Increased temperatures create increased heat strokes inside of the jail. In 2012, one of the hottest years in human history, 10 inmates died of a heat stroke in Texas within 10 days. In New Hampshire, prisoners went on a food strike to fight for fans during a heat wave. These are the type of conditions that will become more common with climate change. And in California, the state Supreme Court said their prisons were overcrowded, and they said that they needed to let people out. But California said, well, we can't let anyone out because we're saving more than $80 million a year with our slavery. This is the system that we're fighting. Next slide. So the school to prison pipeline. This is another thing that hits kind of close to home because this system, it targets black and brown kids. And I had been caught up in there, and I got expelled for bringing herbal supplements to school because the first ingredient was ginger, but it was the ingredients were mostly in Chinese and Mandarin, and the white institution was like, "What is this? This is foreign. This must be a drug. You're going to jail." And so this is the reality of the system that we live in. The prison industrial complex begins affecting people as young as 5 years old with the school to prison pipeline. The school to prison pipeline is a system that targets black and brown kids, criminalizing them from as early as kindergarten through racially biased disciplining. Schools in people of color neighborhoods are not given the resources to succeed, and mistakes are handled not by security guards like richer neighborhoods, but they have actual police that come into the campuses and can charge them, creating a criminal record in high school. Youth of color are suspended at a higher rate, leading to falling behind that can lead to expulsion. Students that drop out or are expelled are at a higher risk for prison. Now, many people think that, oh, this is someone else's problem, but next slide. This is Seattle, y'all. Seattle was actually federally investigated for their racially biased disciplining. The lines on the bottom are how they discipline white and Asian students. The line at the very top, the orange line, is how they're disciplining African American students. Next slide. So these laws and institutions that create this system of oppression by themselves do not look racist, but together they disproportionately affect people of color, especially black people. And by and large, all of these institutions and policies are mainly created by white men. This is why there is no such thing as reverse racism, because racism requires institutional power. It describes a system that privileges white people. What is racist is denying that there is a problem. The all lives matter or I don't see color approaches erases our existence and disqualifies our needs. White people have no authority to make judgment on racism for the same reason men don't with sexism. They aren't experiencing the same realities as people of color in a white supremacist nation. Living in a racist system is dangerous. I'm an activist who fights for economic justice, climate justice, democracy, and racial justice. And yet it's only my Black Lives Matter activism that's gotten me death threats and resulted in my motorcycle being sabotaged. White America is not a safe place for us. We have higher infant mortalities and blood pressure even when perfectly healthy physically. This is from the stress of trying to fit in a system that was not made for us. Black male teens are more than 20 times more likely than their white counterpart to get killed by the police. Polluting industries are zoned into minority neighborhoods, shortening our lifespan. And now climate change is racist, not only affecting people of color the most, but the climate policies are racist. At 2 degrees of warming, much of Africa and South America's soil becomes infertile. At 2 degrees of warming, small island nation goes underwater. 2 degrees of warming, 2 degrees of warming is when white people burn. That's why indigenous people Africa and small island nations at the climate talks demanded 1.5 to stay alive. And yet, the mainstream environmental and climate movement has continued to go on with 2 degrees as a safe target. This is a difference between climate change advocacy and climate justice, because climate justice is led by and centered for communities of color. Thank you.
Now we're next slide. We're now going to talk about Coca-Cola. I mean capitalism. Next slide. So first, a Wikipedia definition. The economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by a minority for profit, this is the capitalist class. A majority of people sell their ability to work for a salary, and this is the working class. Next slide. In reality, capitalism is the political and economic system in which corporate empires have the legal power to oppress, exploit, and dehumanize people, extract, commodify, and pollute the natural resources of Mother Earth for profit. Next slide. So it started 200 years ago with the Industrial Revolution, when we went from hand production to machine production, when we were able to produce at a large scale, make more profit, and cut corners to make profit. And that's when we started seeing more slavery. We started seeing child labor. We started using coal to produce in our factories. And that's when we also started to see the income gap increase. The elite class in their powdered wigs, while we saw this exploitation. Next slide. And we haven't moved away from it today. We still see exploitation. We heard from Sarah about incarcerated slave labor that still is going on, that accounts for a huge portion of our economy. We still see sweatshops where people are exploited in inhuman conditions, and we see the physical manifestation of this pollution in our waters, in our air, in our land, in our food. And so 200 years later, we are now at a point where 1% of the world has 99% of the wealth. This is a graph from 2012. And I'm sure you know the realities of this income discrepancy. Next slide. So capitalism allows corporations to have loopholes. They don't pay taxes, they get subsidies, while the government is, oh, we don't have money for education, we don't have money for healthcare, we don't have money for women's reproductive rights. Whereas CEOs make millions of dollars without paying taxes. Capitalism is getting away scot-free. When we see oil trains explode, who bears the brunt of that cost? It's going to be the communities. This hits really close to home. You all know what happened 10 days ago. And this is not just oil trains, right? It is water, it is rivers, it is air. Next slide. And we can't trust the media either. What we hear in the news, the reality is never projected. In 2011, the media is now owned by the same companies. 90% of media is owned by 6 companies. So they control what we hear, they control what we read. Next slide. And capitalism is embedded so deeply in us that we don't even recognize it, that we refuse to see that there are solutions. When people in our own communities are like, oh, how do we move past this? We heard this critique so many times last year during Shell and also during Break Free, and that is the hole that capitalism has in our minds and consciousness. Next slide. So how did we get so deeply embedded in the system? In 1955, after the Second World War, when our leaders were thinking about how do we grow our nation's economy, here's what they came up with. Our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfaction, our ego satisfaction in consumption. We need things consumed, burned up, replaced, and discarded at an ever-accelerating rate. Instead of thinking about, should we think about more healthcare, should we think about education, they decided that we need to consume things faster and dispose of them quicker. Next slide. So this is the linear system we live in. It is a linear system on a finite planet. And that is not sustainable. At every step of this process, from extraction to disposal, there is exploitation of land resources, of people, there is pollution. A finite planet cannot sustain a system like this. We need to move towards closed loop systems. Next slide. So we consume twice as much now than we did 50 years ago. Here in this country, we have 5% of the world's population, and we use 30% of the resources and produce 30% of the waste. Next slide. If everyone on our planet consumed at this rate, we would need 5 planets to sustain us. And how do we measure our success? With this number, the GDP. And this means more is better. It doesn't matter what this more is. More pollution, more production, more output. That is success. We're not thinking about the consequences of these actions. We're not thinking about the future generations. We're not thinking, are we going to have things to consume? Are we going to have safe water? Are we going to have clean food to eat? For the sake of profit, we think of this as success. Next slide. Capitalism is greed. It is selfishness. It is short-sightedness. Next slide. And where does that leave us as people? We are overworked. We believe that we need to work 40 hours is not enough to make a living wage. People work 50, 60, 70 hours and still don't survive. We're isolated. We've lost touch with our communities. We don't have that support system. We're unhealthy, and we're really unhappy in this system. We look around and we see more people depressed than we've ever seen before. We see so many kinds of illnesses, mental distress. Next slide. We've lost touch with nature. We've lost touch with our spiritual selves. Next slide. Symptoms include homelessness, unemployment, poverty, hunger, powerlessness, fear, apathy, boredom, cultural decay, loss of identity, extreme self-consciousness, loss of free speech, incarceration, suicidal thoughts, death. Death. That is capitalism. Next slide. It is the market system. It is when we think that Mother Earth is a commodity. It is when we think we can package water and bottle water. Next slide. This is capitalism, where Monsanto has gotten away with poisoning us, poisoning our food, poisoning our land, and they can still do it. They have so much power over people for the sake of profit. Next slide. The CEO of Nestle said access to water should not be a public right. Next slide. Whereas indigenous people have said water is sacred. Yesterday, Paul came to one of our meetings and he said, if you don't believe that you're connected to the world, try and go without water for 3 days and then see what that feels like. Next slide. I saw this a week ago. A Canadian startup is now selling selling bottled air in China. So this is where we've already come to that point where we have to now buy oxygen. Water, land, oxygen, food, all of these things are being commodified. Next slide. And they're not done. The TPP, are we fighting this? We have to. This is the secret trade agreement between 12 countries that will give them power to sue local governments. If we try and stop them from doing what they're doing, they can sue governments and carry on as usual, carry on destroying our communities, destroying our planet. We have to stop this. Next slide. You all know about Exxon. You all know that it's just 90 companies that have caused this crisis that we're in. This is capitalism. Next slide. And so this carbon bubble, you've heard about this term too probably, but this is what our stock market currently is based on. These fossil fuel companies, some of the most powerful companies in the world, their stock market value is based on fossil fuel that is still under the ground. So their intention and the whole economic structure of the world that trades billions of dollars a day is based on the vision that they're going to extract and sell and make a profit of fossil fuel that we know we cannot touch. So that is the vision, and that's the goal and strategy of corporate companies, especially the fossil fuel empire. Next slide. But now they have to admit that there's a problem. They cannot go away without recognizing that this is a crisis that people are standing up to. And so they start to offer us false solutions. They use words like mitigation and adaptation and carbon offsets. Carbon war is an example of a false solution. Before we accept solutions that are market solutions, we need to think about who's being impacted, who's going to pay the actual cost. These are just ways for them to continue to doing business as usual without being accountable to reality. Next slide. This is an incredible book that I've read by a woman called Vandana Shiva, Earth Democracy. She says, the earth does not belong to man, man belongs to the earth, all things are connected. Chief Seattle sell that. And next slide. What she goes on to explain in this book is that there's 3 economies that really need to be in balance for us to live in harmony. We have focused our entire attention on the first, the globalized market economy that creates scarcity, encloses the commons. It gives more rights to corporations over people. It invisibilizes people. Capital is more powerful than people. It's greed over need. And it has ignored nature's economy. Nature has her own cycle of producing water and producing forest and producing land. And through capitalism, we have ignored and destroyed nature's economy. The third system, the sustenance economy, this is how indigenous people around the world survived for centuries. They took what they needed and they thrived and they had harmonious, they were healthy, they were rich, they were successful, but they knew their responsibility to nature's economy. They worked to sustain their lives, but they were careful to stay in balance. These were the crafts and peasant agriculture, indigenous forest economies. This is when humans produced in balance with nature. And this is where we have to go back. These are the solutions of going back to be in harmony. Next slide. So just transition is a term you will hear a lot when you are doing this work. And it is really important to think and work towards a just transition that goes back to those principles of staying in balance. We don't want to just shift away to renewables blindly. That can continue to perpetuate capitalism. We need to dismantle capitalism and put into place solutions that are local, that are people-powered solutions that think about these principles that we talked about. These are local businesses. These are closed-loop, sustainable businesses like co-ops. Next slide. So I'm going to leave you with this last question. This is a video that I saw a few years ago of an island a few thousand miles in the middle of the ocean, in the Pacific Ocean, where albatross birds live. And they've lived there, and this island is now surrounded by plastic. This is disposable plastic that we throw away without a second thought, bottle caps and lighters and pen caps. And parent birds are feeding their babies this plastic. And this island in this video is full of these images of baby birds dying because what they're being fed by their parents is plastic. And the video asks this question: do we have the courage to face the realities of our time and allow ourselves to feel deeply enough that it transforms us and our future? Thank you. Next slide. And now I'm handing it over to Zarna.
Okay. So we've talked about a lot of really heavy things. So we're gonna talk about something lighthearted now. Next slide. Fans of the patriarchy in the house, I see. So patriarchy, what is it exactly? Next slide. A society is patriarchal to the extent that it is male-dominated, male-identified, and male-centered. One of its key characteristics is the oppression of women. Another one of its key characteristics is the oppression of transgender people, is the oppression of queer people. So we see that anything that is not what is considered masculine is oppressed. Next slide. And this manifests in various ways within our society. One of the ways that we're seeing a lot is the gender pay gap. For every dollar that a man makes, white women make 77 cents. Black women make 69 cents, and Hispanic women make 57 cents. So what we see here is that not only is there a disparity between men and white women, but there's a disparity between within gender and race also. And this is across every single industry. It doesn't matter how high up you go. Every single industry, we see these same statistics. And what that means is that it averages out to $11,000 a year of losses in wages for a woman. $11,000 a year, every year, for the rest of your life. And yet, despite this, women are still expected to go to work and then also do the most of the child rearing. Next slide. And when they go to work, they are kept subordinate, they are kept down. If they are in a leadership position, they are called bossy, outspoken, loud, nagging. When they're in leadership positions, when they have things to say, this is how they're spoken to. And yet when men have opinions, they're leaders, they're visionaries, they're strong, they're courageous. Women's ideas get co-opted by men. And by the way, most NGOs are led by white men. Within our language, in our society, this manifests where boys are taught from a very early age to associate anything that is bad with femininity. You play like a girl. You run like a girl. Stop crying like a girl. Right? In other words, they're taught that anything feminine is inherently wrong. And meanwhile, women and girls are told to calm down. Don't be so emotional. Are you sure you remember it right? These are the ways that we teach our girls that they don't matter, that their feelings are not consequential. And girls are also taught that they will always be judged on their looks. That's what they're taught. No matter what, they're always judged on their looks because science has told us that men have this evolutionary drive to mate with all of the women that they consider to be pretty, and therefore they're going to go for the hourglass figure, and they're going to go for these types of looks, and that's what they want, so you're always going to be judged that way. In fact, within nature, what we see is that it is usually the males of the species who have to impress the females with the looks, not the other way around. So this is a way in which science also oppresses us. Why? Because the tenets of Western science were written by white men. That's why. Next slide. Relationship inequality. As we said, women are expected to do the most of the child rearing, most of the chores. Women take their husband's name. They lose their own identity. They're always expected to give, and men are always expected to take. And what we get is violence against women. In a society where boys are taught women are inherently wrong, femininity is inherently wrong, 1 in 3 women in the US will experience domestic abuse. Most female homicides are committed by their partners, 3 every day. So in the movies and in the shows, when we see, oh, it's some guy crawling in through the window and he's going to get you. No, he's already in your house. You live with him. And of course, this manifests as rape culture, where we blame the victims, who are usually women, not always, but usually women. They're blamed for being raped. That's why only 32% of all rapes are reported. And that's a conservative estimate. Only 32 instances, rates of rape are reported. And society depicts women as existing for the pleasure of men. Next slide. So here are some facts about rape. 63% of all reported rapes are committed by white males. And yet, women cross the road to get away from the black men. 63%. Women of color, most likely to be raped. And the worst is for Native American women, 34.1%. Mixed race women, 24.4%. Black women, 18.8%. And white women, 17.7%. And Asian Pacific Islander women, 6.8%. This is the reality of rape culture, but you'll never see it. You'll never see it in the mainstream. 21.8% of all rapes suffered by women are gang rapes. This means this isn't just lone men deciding to do this. This means men get together and have a ritual of doing this. It is culture. 8 out of 10 women in the military experience rape and/or sexual assault. Official documents call it unwanted sexual contact. They don't call it rape or assault in order to protect the men. 60% of all rapes in prisons are committed by prison staff. So what we're taught is, oh, you know, in prison, you're probably going to get raped and it's probably going to be by your cellmate or someone else. No, it's by the people who are paid to lock you up. And 21% of transgender, genderqueer, and gender non-conforming college students have experienced sexual violence compared to 18% of non-trans, genderqueer, or non-conforming females, and 4% of non-trans, genderqueer, or non-conforming males. 1 out of 10 rape victims is male, but it's almost never reported. Why? Because of patriarchy. Men are never allowed to seem weak. Next slide. 35 women accused Bill Cosby of rape. Allegations went on for 10 years, and it took until 2016 for him to be charged in Pennsylvania with 1 count of rape. Rape culture is needing Cosby to admit that he's guilty before we believe it. Next slide. So this is what white male privilege looks like. This guy, and this isn't his mugshot, this is his college application, smiley face, privileged white male picture that the media showed. He raped an unconscious woman and he got sentenced to 6 months in jail. And by the way, it came out just in the last 24 hours that he will not be serving 6 months in jail. He will be released on September 2nd. 3 months. Meanwhile, Jasmine Abdullah Richards, a Black Lives Matter activist, was peacefully protesting, and she protected a woman from the cops during that protest. And she was arrested and convicted of felony lynching, even though she committed no violence. She faces up to 4 years in jail. This is what happens to women. And this is what happens to men. And even then, the fact that he was even convicted was because the jury was like, oh my God, this person is clearly guilty. But the judge said, oh no, only 6 months, because prison would really affect him. It would ruin his life. You see, he ruined this woman's life, but that doesn't matter. Next slide. But you see, Bell Hooks tells us something very important. She says the first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves. If an individual is not successful in emotionally crippling himself, he can count on patriarchal men to enact rituals of power that will assault his self-esteem. Stop crying. Man up. Boys don't cry. Be a man. This is what boys are taught from a very young age by other boys, and particularly by the men in their lives. And because of this, they have to cripple themselves. They have to kill off the emotional parts of themselves. Even though they're human and therefore they have feelings, they're all supposed to feel because we're all supposed to feel. Next slide. So what does this have to do with climate change? Well, we frack for gas, and we drill for oil, and we mine for coal, and we burn it all up, and we go into the atmosphere. And this is what many people think is climate change. This is what many people understand is climate change. And if you notice, what it means is we take from the earth. We take from the earth. Next slide. Why? Because in our culture of patriarchy, we look upon this earth as an object, exactly the same way men look upon women. As if she exists only for our pleasure. As if her consent doesn't matter. As if she has no thoughts of her own. And this is what happens. This is why we take and take and take from the earth, and it doesn't matter whether or not she's screaming in pain. And we also do the same thing to animals. We treat animals and this earth exactly the same way men treat women. Next slide. Because animal agriculture is the single biggest driver of climate change. But the mainstream will never tell you that. National Geographic did a study, and they came out with that study, and they said 18% of all greenhouse gas emissions globally come from animal agriculture. That's more than the entire transportation sector combined. More. So everyone's worried about their car. It's the food on your plate. And then, not only that, but there were other groups and there were other scientists and there were other studies and there were other colleges and there were universities all over the world who looked at that study and said, wait a minute, you haven't factored in dead zones in the ocean that come from the feces and urine that come from all of these factories, that come from raising cattle for meat. Wait a minute, you haven't factored in the deforestation. 80% of all forests on this planet that have been cut down to make way for animal agriculture. Wait a minute, you haven't factored in all of the water that is necessary for animal agriculture. 25 gallons of water required to grow one pound of wheat. 2,500 gallons of water required to grow 1 pound of beef. It is devastating. And so many different groups did lots and lots of different studies and said, no, it's 38%. No, it's 40%. The World Watch Institute looked at all of it and said, no, it is 51% or more. That's devastating. Next slide. But the mainstream movement will tell you, National Sustainable Seafood Day. We need to sustainably fish. The ocean is 70% empty. There is no such thing as sustainable fishing. It doesn't exist. And yet, we have the mainstream telling us, California is like going through a drought and like these almonds are a problem. These almonds are a problem. Almond growth takes 10% of the water in California. Meat and dairy in California takes 47%. 47%. Organic meat, we need to eat all organic meat. Yeah, except that if we all ate organic grass-fed beef, we would need 5 Earths. It is not sustainable. It cannot happen in any reality. But the excuses that you'll hear from the mainstream movement about why they never talk about it is, you can't talk about meat because no one will listen. This is utter nonsense. Because the mainstream movement never talks about it, the grassroots does. And the grassroots around the world have started producing films and videos and articles and papers, and they do presentations like this. And what has happened in the UK as a result of that is that over the last 5-10 years, veganism is up by 350%. In this country, people who say that they're vegetarian or vegan has gone from 1% to 5%. Okay? That's what happens when the facts get into the hands of the public. The other excuse that you'll hear is veganism is white privilege. Because white people came up with it. And so it's just another form of colonization, right? It's just another form of colonization. This is despite the fact that a plant-based lifestyle, a vegetarian lifestyle, comes from India, where they have 500 million people who live a vegetarian lifestyle. And they have lived this lifestyle for thousands of years. Thousands. This is where this movement actually comes from. But what is white privilege is white people co-opting the ideas of people of color. What is white privilege is white people saying, well, everyone needs to just be vegan and that will make everything okay, when they have the money and they have access to fresh fruits and vegetables and people of color don't. That's white privilege. That's what we need to change. Next slide. This is the projected impact of climate change on agricultural yields. All of these countries in red and yellow and orange, they're all going to starve. This is happening in India right now. There is a devastating climate change-induced drought. There is a devastating heat wave. Temperatures soared to 123.8 degrees. That's the highest it's ever been since records began. The human body begins to cook at 103. And farmers are committing suicide. Not only are people dying simply from the heat, simply because the water has dried up, because there's no food, they're starving, the farmers are losing everything. So they're committing suicide, and this has been going on for a long time, years, because of what Monsanto has done by scamming them with genetically modified seeds. It's been going on for years. This year, it's different. This year, it's not just the men who are committing suicide. When the men were committing suicide, they were committing suicide because they've lost everything. And now, because they've lost everything, they have nothing to show for themselves. How can they call themselves men when they have nothing? So they kill themselves. But this year, the women are killing themselves too. And it's because they're making pacts with their husbands that we will die together. Why? Because if both parents are dead, there's a chance that the state will feed their children. When women commit suicide, they do it in the last-ditch hope to protect their children. Next slide. As I said, we fight wars, right? Who suffers the most in war? It's always the women. It's always the women. Even if you discount the bombs dropping on you. You've got rape. You've got homelessness. You've got starvation. You've got contaminated water. You've got dead children. You've got lack of protection from their male family members because they're all off fighting the wars. Women always suffer the most. Next slide. And it's indigenous women who suffer more than everyone, murdered at 10 times the national average in this country. 61% of Native women suffer assault in their lifetimes, mostly by non-Native men. You know who it actually is? It's the fossil fuel workers who come onto indigenous lands to extract their resources without their permission, without their say-so, but they're just objects, right? And they abduct these women and they sell them into sexual slavery. This is what is happening because of patriarchy. Next slide. And yet the mainstream movement is run by white men because they understand what women go through. They understand what the most marginalized people are dealing with. It is unacceptable. And within our movements, what we see is mansplaining. What we see is white-splaining. When the indigenous people speak up, and when the women speak up, and when the marginalized people speak up, the men come along and say, no, you don't understand. It needs to be like this because we say so. Next slide. Women can be patriarchal too. How many white feminists I have heard say, but what does race have to do with gender? it's pretty clear what race has to do with gender. Because guess what? Men of color were treated by white males in this same way. Men of color were never allowed to be called men. That's why the slaves were called boy. It didn't matter how old they were. That's why men of color were called savages, were called animals. They could never be men. The only men are white men. And who? White men with money, with power, with prestige. An older lady in an NGO told me, smashing patriarchy is just rhetoric that emotional 22-year-old girls say. We must be nice to encourage dialogue. She said women must be nice to the men to encourage dialogue. This is patriarchy. It's called tone policing. When you can't argue with what someone says, so you argue with how they say it. Next slide. This is the result. Poverty and desperation and starvation and no hope. Forced to beg from the very people who have done this to them. This is the result. Next slide. And yet you see, it's so much worse than you thought. Because the pollution that comes from the capitalist, colonialist, patriarchal, racist culture goes into the ocean. And that means ocean acidification. Next slide. The reason why that's bad is because plankton, which are these tiny microscopic life forms that form the basis of the entire food chain, because of the acid in the ocean, plankton is going extinct. A recent study that came out just a few weeks ago told us 40% of the plankton in the ocean is gone. And when plankton goes extinct, the entire food chain will collapse. And when the entire food chain collapses, we will have no food and we will have no air, because plankton also produces over 50% of all of the oxygen we breathe. We will have no food, we will have no water, and we will have no air, and we will have no water, because it's all polluted with the carbon. Next slide. Because of this, in 2002, scientists agreed that the world faces mass extinction. That means 70 to 90% of all life on this planet, including us, will go extinct. Including us. And in 2015, scientists came out and told us we are not facing mass extinction. We are already in it. Next slide. So let us remember the words of Chief Sealth. Earth does not belong to man. Man belongs to the earth. It turns out that we are all animals indigenous to this planet. We are not physically attached to empire. We are physically attached to this planet. Therefore, we must stand up to defend her. And I'm going to hand it to Yen.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so let's breathe for a moment, because that was probably a bit much. How many people have been, it was first time to the Duwamish Longhouse? First time? Oh, nice. All right. And so how many people have learned something new tonight? All right. And how many people feel uncomfortable with what they've learned? All right. Thank you. I just want to get you in the heart a little bit, because sometimes all of this gets us in the head, and so just breathe. We're ready. So I'm Yin, like the feminine energy, and this is Alex, and we're co-presenting this leverage point portion. So I just want to remind that how the system was, or is. So we cut down 3,000-year-old old-growth forests that was abundant here, and we replaced that with a number called GDP. right? So the system hasn't been working for the people from the beginning. And we're in a Duwamish Longhouse right now that took about 40 years for them to do this, and 10 years of fundraising and a year of building. And they used to have 300 of these longhouses all around King County, and now there's only one that they had to rebuild themselves. So we have to recognize that this hasn't been working from the beginning. So what we're really good at with the system is intellectualizing everything. I went to grad school, so I knew, like, paid a lot of money for a piece of paper for theories. And what we learn is about the iceberg model. So that's basically what the environmental organizations do, is they talk about the symptoms. We're really good about treating symptoms, but we never look up and see what's causing that symptom. And so the full iceberg. And what happens is that we get caught in this feedback loop of serving this productive capitalism, this endless feedback loop that makes us insecure and unsure how to break free from.
So when you only see the tip of the iceberg in terms of like literature, like environmental science, it leads to misconceptions and it upholds power structures so that people in power are credible and non-intellectuals. People without like that kind of education are not credible. And this masks the realization that we're all stuck in systems of oppression. And it also leads to the thought of colonized time, which we'll get to. Next slide. Next slide. So basically what colonized time is a thinking process that prioritizes efficiency, production, has no connection to emotion, focuses on the end product and productivity rather than relationships or processes. And so for me, this might be a common experience for some, might not be for others, but school taught me to be obsessed with college, grades, and basically I've been sleep deprived since 8th grade. And I thought I had to get a really lucrative job and go to a top-notch school, and so this fear basically made me be an adult too early and made me stop living. And so only now that I understand systems of oppression, I realize that this colonized mindset, this colonized time, is a way to funnel kids into factory jobs and factory work in a factory system in which they perpetuate systems of oppression and they don't analyze and they can't analyze and they're continuing to be oppressed. And so whenever I talk to Yin, who is a systems thinker of many years, I realize that my mind is very colonized, not just the concepts that I think about, but the processes in which I think are always based on what's the most efficient, what's the most productive, how can I make the most out of this, and I deem a lot of other things just worthless, and I don't think about them. And so when we think like this, what happens is that there's little time for people to pause or heal from their oppression. There's little time to analyze the systems of oppression in their lives and how they perpetuate them. And people do not make connections with community and feel deeply because they don't think it's important, or they don't realize that it's important. And so even activists do this. There's a lot of organizing that I've seen, even though I haven't even been in the movement for very long, but it focuses on going to the event, doing the agenda, whatever's on the agenda, like making a decision and then leaving. And it's impersonal and it doesn't stress community, which is vital to make people feel connected and to feel invested in the movement and to each other. And so one example is a lot of white organizing does not emphasize food enough. And even if they have food, a lot of times it's not very good. And so, and for POC, food is culture, it's family, it's love, it's community. And so whenever I hang out with my activist friends, they always feed me or I feed them. And like it creates a sense of community and trust. And so when people, when white spaces don't have this, it feels like you're betrayed a little bit because there's no sense of like nourishment and that they care about you. And so people don't have time in this colonized world to make connections with their community and feel deeply. Um, yeah. So I want to talk about internet culture a bit, because in this world we have to cope a lot because we're oppressed. So there are a lot of ways that we unconsciously and consciously cope with all of this oppression. And so I'm not trying to bash social media. I'm trying to be sensitive about this because I know a lot of my peers love social media, and but I see a lot of flaws in it. So I think our generation, and like all generations, but our generation in specific, is very insecure, and that in part is due to social media. And so while social media can be empowering, like definitely very empowering, it can also be very oppressive. Because what you're doing is you're posting and you want people to like you, and you create this, maybe it's not ingenuine, but it's not a full picture of who you are, and you always just want like people to like you, and you look up to people and you say, oh, this image that they've created for themselves is super cool, and I want to be like that. You have no idea what's going on in their lives. And so I've seen this going on with Instagram a lot. I personally am also on Instagram, and I am guilty of this as well, but a lot of it is creating a certain aesthetic and kind of being a part of this culture in which you think you're cool. And that's all good until it gets to capitalism, because a lot of the social justice movements on the internet are really intersectional, except with climate justice and capitalism. They don't understand, and they don't have analysis of capitalism. So they have like promoting different codes for like clothing stores or makeup stores, and they say like, sorry, they want you to use their codes, and so they can get money. But they're at the same time they're glorifying this empowering image of using makeup or using clothes. And while it can be empowering, I definitely think makeup can be empowering. You also have to understand it's part of patriarchy, and you're still part of this system. It's still a coping mechanism that is not solving the system.
Okay, so we're criticizing environmentalism only because I know it very, very well. I've been in it for 8 years, and the way that I enter into the movement is through the big nonprofit NGOs that we've been talking about all evening. So the approach is very individualistic. It's always about what am I doing that's not enough? Like, am I carrying around like a whole bag of containers all the time with all my cups and my bowls and my bags? Like, I'm always lugging a lot of things, and this movement makes me feel very guilty that I'm never doing enough. And then we're out there doing this ivy removal and blackberries, and I'm fighting, and I'm getting all this wars from doing all this invasive, but it's still very symptomatic approach. It's not looking upstream on like what is the condition that's allowing these ivies to grow.
So my journey with environmentalism starts in sophomore year. I became the president of my school's Earth Corps, and I basically only did it because I wanted like a leadership role that I could put on my college app and make me look really good. But then I realized that climate change is real, and so I was like, oh no. So I got really involved in YMCA Earth Service Corps, which I love, and it's a really empowering organization, but they also only focus on like restoration and, like Yen said, a lot of symptomatic work. And so I was kind of obsessed with composting at Garfield. Like, that's a big thing at Garfield. And I thought that like every single thing that I did was really important. Like, it helped a lot, even if it was a little action. And I think that's generally true, but I also didn't fail to see that it wasn't helping the system, like, or it wasn't solving the problems, like meaning the system. And so this relates to the iceberg intellectualization idea, because only the top is shown of this movement, only this symptomatic intellectual part where you use science and you go really like, it's really hopeful. and you don't talk about the real problems about people dying in the global south and climate justice in general.
So, because of a byproduct of the environmentalism, then I go off and do my projects. I'm here to do my white savior complex, and I create a garden for the Ever Housing Authority with the Linwood High School horticulture. And I come in and do a garden and don't talk to any of the community members that are left with my garden and ask them what they want in the garden. And I use their youth to build the garden. So, I got media attention for it, but it wasn't really helping anybody. And then I go to Philippines 3 months after the typhoon, same thing, go to build earthships, do what I did, and there's no long-term relationship or effects to actually help them. I was only there for a week. And that's what the system do, is they just produce the savior complex.
And for me, one of the projects that I did was I got a grant that was supposed to be about water quality and like water problems, and I bought a bunch of water bottles from China, and I had this really cool design that I spent a really long time working on, and I thought that we could give them to the people in our school that could not afford / didn't know the issues in terms of buying bottled water. And so we bought them from China, and because it was cheap, because I wanted this other sustainable company, but it was too expensive. And then we proceeded to try to sell them, and that didn't work very well. So we tried to give them out to people, being like, "You're holding a bottled water, like a plastic bottle. Why don't I just give you this?" And they all looked at me really weirdly. So the problem with this is that it's catering to the system. It's working within the system. I failed to see that this is not going to change that much, and I'm really hurting more people because I ordered them from China. They weren't very good quality. They broke pretty fast. And it also wasn't a community effort. It was me being all saviory and being like, I'm going to give this to the people that can't afford it. I didn't talk to them. I didn't know the situation. I just assumed. And I was just trying to be productive with this grant, and because there was money and I used it.
All right, so the way that our analysis is going to be explained through this Bacana Institute two-loop theory. And so what tends to happen with like carbon Washington that we're talking about is something that's working within the system. And we know that it's declining. We know people are dying. We know this capitalistic system is not working. And so what we're talking about is creating a brand new system. Next slide. So what we do is, in order to create a brand new system, is disrupting the system and through direct action. Do you want to talk about that? No. Okay. Next slide.
So before we talk about that, or before we disrupt the system, we need to understand why we're going to do it. And so for me, the core of activism is love. And that sounds really cheesy. It's true. And so... and so we need to establish support structures, which means building community. And so when I first met Zarna, I did not know her at all. I just emailed her, and then I met her like a day later, and then she was like, let's meet up, let's have a meeting. And so we met up at this like bubble tea shop and talked for like a really long time. And I did not know her, but then we did know each other. And that's kind of how everything works in this movement. I went to her Bhakti yoga session, and she talked about ego and love. And so or ego is the opposite of love, not hate. And so when people are full of ego, they lose their compassion, they lose their connection with the divine and with compassion and with love. And Zarna really does practice this. I know that her activism comes from a place of love, and she calls out people because of love. And she calls them out because she wants them to make the right decisions, and she wants the world to be a better place, and that's love. And for Yin, I've seen Yin like 6 out of 7 days this week. And so we're not just like partners, we're friends. And so she created this circle of Asian women where we talk about all of our problems as Asian women. She was my chaperone at Break Free. She was my chaperone at my school's cultural relations trip. And we go to the same events, and then we get food. And so And so it's not networking anymore. It's networking versus friendship. Networking is this word that people use when they want to use people. They want to use them for their resources and for their wisdom or whatever, but they don't actually want to get to know them. And so the reason why I'm invested in this movement is because there are people that I love and there are people that love me in it. And how are you supposed to be invested in something if you don't have people that you care about that are being hurt by it or and that you're fighting for? Because it's hard to not know anyone and to be like, I'm fighting for something that's happening across the world and I don't even know. And so when I have my Youth of Color Speak Out meetings, which is a group I created inspired by this group, initially I had an agenda and I was like, we were all talking about this presentation, what we were gonna do for this. And then Yin told me that I should just talk to them and have like discussions and ask them how their day was and ask them what is sitting heavy in their hearts. And so I did, and that was the most productive part of creating all these ideas. And so that's just how it works. Like if you have an agenda in mind and you don't care about the people, then you're not gonna get to the heart of it.
Next slide. All right, so the reason that we do direct action is because we only need 3.5%. That's the direct action theory. 3.5% of nonviolent continuous direct action is in the past how people have overturned an empire. And so when we idle, then the dominant narrative, you know, Trump, gets control the main media. And so it's what we need is only 3.5, and that's not a lot of people.
So my first exposure, or I guess second exposure, but first like big exposure to direct action was Break Free, pretty big. And what I learned from it was direct action is real and direct action works. So, yeah, so it was my first exposure to the indigenous community and the physical environment that is like the toxic environment of oil refineries. But it was also an introduction into how there's such a big community that I had not seen before that is hopeful, they're motivated. Every single person that goes to direct action is so motivated and like they're all coming together for this one thing, and you know that like they're all gonna give it their all, and you have people shouting like crazy things and like people that are way braver than me, and I was just so inspired. And it was just really empowering because Women of Color Speak Out, we spoke, and it was my first time like speaking in front of a big crowd and doing a rally, and just like they pulled me on the stage and were like, we're gonna give a panel, and I was like, okay. Yeah, and so it gave me a chance to speak my mind and step out of my comfort zone, and shows me that there is room for youth in direct action as well.
And just a reminder from Grace Lee Boggs that it needs to be nonviolent because we need to give each other the capacity to grow our souls. And so we show up at, you know, our work is keeping our elected officials accountable. And when we're not there, our voices is not represented. And one of the first times that I met Alex was when we were taking over Patty Murray's office for the second time to talk to her about the TPP. And some of the grannies were here. And, you know, we're probably due for our visit. So you're welcome to join us the next time we take over her office. So I think it's important that we stand to let everybody know where our voice is and what our opinion is. And when we don't, then the dominant narrative takes over.
So this is the model minority myth. Basically, Asians are thought of to be academically, socially, and economically more successful and privileged compared to other people of color. And I've kind of believed this for my entire life. It's a myth. So this is harmful because of various reasons. It makes Asian people feel like they're too privileged to question white supremacy, so they just stay under it and they continue to be oppressed. It forces you to think in terms of white supremacy, in terms of success. So we base our successes off of a white supremacist society. It makes Asian people think that they aren't people of color. I've had like 2 freshmen come up to me and be like, "Can I be in your group? Is POC only meaning black people?" And I'm like, "No, you're a person of color. Please do not believe that you're not a person of color." And it also makes it feel like a lot of Asian people and I guess non-black people they don't have a place in the social justice conversation because even though white and black conversation is very important, it's always or often just a white and black rhetoric, and I'm always left wondering, where do I fit in? And this myth also puts pressures on Asian Americans to fit into the stereotype of effortless perfection. And often this stereotype is like seen as for only East Asians, like that's just what you picture. And so often Southeast Asians and a lot of other Asian people that don't fit into the stereotype, they'll drop out of school, they'll feel like they don't fit in and they're not being true to this culture. And it also hurts other POC who aren't fitting up to the Asian standard, this like model minority and these good stereotypes that we have for Asian people. And so when I was talking about Youth of Color Speak Out for this, we discussed how a lot of our parents are immigrants and they came to the US and they built their way up. They didn't have that much money. And so now they want us to be successful like them as well. And so they want us to go into these corporate jobs, doctor, lawyer, etc. And to get really good higher education and to assimilate like they did. And for them, assimilation was a form of protection. And now it's perpetuating systems of oppression and keeping us complacent and unquestioning the system due to our apparent success. And so now that we know about the model minority myth, naming white supremacy, and understanding how each of our cultures fits into combating white supremacy is very important.
Thank you. Charles, next slide. So what we're calling for is for a shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. And it's just a reminder from the Highline Center back in the civil rights movement, you know, a space that was created in the South allowed people to find their voices. Next slide. So where Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King was able to go through the center, and that supported the civil rights movement and the labor movement. And so as we're doing this work, it's talk about being in community, as Alex has said, and also standing with indigenous rights, where there's a reason that we brought everyone here so that you understand where the Duwamish is currently at and where we're at. We're gonna move through this. We also need to stand in solidarity with queer and transgender rights, and the fact that I don't experience harassment when I go to the bathroom, that's my privilege. And this whole bathroom conversation is about creating safety for everybody. And if you don't understand their perspectives, then our movement is not intersectional and it will not move forward. And historically, especially when they're held up as two spirits, as somebody very special, now because of capitalism, patriarchy, they're not welcomed in this system. And also just recognizing the youth are leading this movement. When UW is decolonizing UW, and they're also taking over Seattle U to call for accountability in higher education. We have to show up for what they're leading. When we're doing social justice, climate justice, we have to also be there for what youth are pushing for, keeping accountability from a higher education.
So this is a picture of a forum that I organized at Garfield High School after I brought Women of Color Speak Out to Garfield. And it was originally, or it was supposed to be open to everyone, but as you can see, it's mostly women of color. And that kind of suggests that the white men were scared. So this is related to what I'm doing and what Youth of Color are doing right now. But also that point, I kind of wanted to just say, like, white people need to step it up. If the conversations are uncomfortable for a reason, and the fact that so many of our youth who are supposed to be our liberal allies in Seattle, they just didn't show up. And but the youth, obviously, the youth are the future, the youth have the power, and they have the motivation, and they have this spark. And I want to talk about Portland for a sec. So in Portland, they recently just created this new curriculum, mandatory climate justice curriculum, which is crazy. Like, I was so happy about that. And guess who brought that together? It was the youth, and it was the climate justice activists, and they came together and they managed to get a unanimous vote from the Portland Portland School Board. And so that's what I want to work on this summer with my Youth of Color Speak Out and a bunch of other people that I can hopefully get. And in terms of the adults in the room supporting youth, I met Aji Piper at Break Free, and he's part of Earth Guardians. He's part of Planet for the Planet. And he was talking to me about how he's really busy all the time and he doesn't really have a summer, and that's because he's too busy acting like an adult because the adults have failed us. And this is our future, right? So we have to do all of this work now because look at what the government's doing, nothing. And so another thing is, in terms of a personal level, like with your children, with your cousins, nephews, whatever, it's really easy when you're young to feel like because you're young and because you don't have that much experience and knowledge and you haven't been to college and all that stuff, you don't have as much leverage, you don't have as much argument. You can't like argue behind like, this is why I want to be a radical activist. Or like, this is why I want to vote for Jill Stein. And so like, I encourage everyone to really think about their wording and their conversations with youth, because you can disagree, like totally, that's fine, but it's really impactful when it really hurts when it leaves an impact on the youth that says, you are young and therefore your voice is less valid. And that's gonna make them not speak up in the future, and that's gonna make them doubt themselves all the time. And also in terms of household habits, in terms of like being a vegetarian or a vegan, some of my friends wanted me to mention that when they tried to be vegetarian, their parents were just like, oh, it's like, I don't know, I'm being sustainable by buying like sustainable seafood, and like even the like Costco has sustainable meat or something, I don't know. Or like, this is too hard for me, and like I totally understand if it's too hard, but it's also like, if it isn't, or if you can make that leap, like it's really important, because if the kid is wanting it, if the youth are wanting it, it's because it's important to them, it's their future. And so you being unwilling to do something that is maybe simple for you, is oppressing them.
So part of this is just really for us to come together. So I'm part of the Rainier Beach Restorative Justice Project, and when we started having conversations about starting a peacemaking circle there, instantly the teachers jumped right on that idea. And when this discussion is had at other high schools, it's like, oh, but we're not ready. We don't. There's this uncomfortable. And so the difference is that Rainier Beach doesn't have the privilege to wait. The teachers are stepping up. They're trying something. They're holding it for their students on Fridays, and they're holding it doing their meetings. But then other schools are like, no, we can't do this. So it is our privilege when we don't do anything, when we don't change the status quo.
So this is Earth Guardians. It's a native or indigenous youth-led organization that does art and music and climate justice activism. And they're just a really big inspiration to me and a bunch of other youth, and an example of the power of youth and what youth are really doing. Like Shu Tezcott, he spoke at the UN, and that is one of the most inspiring speeches I've ever heard, and I like take quotes from it all the time, and I look up to him a lot. And so these are the people that I'm looking up to, and I think that adults need to look up to them too, because they're doing like the action they're doing, they're bringing their youth motivation and youth spark to the movement.
And I think the single thing that we can all do is to try a plant-based diet. Maybe one meal, maybe one day, but that's the way that we can protest the food industrial complex. Next slide. Just a shout out to the Undoing Racism. I was just there for New Orleans, and they spent the first day 6 hours checking in 300 people. So when we're talking about humanizing a space, when it's POC led, that is what they do. They uphold the principles that they talk about. So if you want to get intellectualized of all the systems and all the terms of gatekeeping and the power structures of how people stay poor, you're welcome there in Seattle. And this activist life, it's not very glamorous. We're on the front lines of white fragility. It's exhausting. And but if we don't show up, then this narrative doesn't change. And even though we were hanging out 6 days a week, sleeping not, and we're getting invited to a lot of places, to Seattle art museums, to the Cornish art schools, because of Amina, and it's an honor and it's also exhausting. And so we're doing this here today for our environmental groups because we need your help. We need your allyship, and we need you to step up because we can't be everywhere. And we need you to speak. We need you to put progressive stack when we're not there. We need you to stand in solidarity with the youth and people of color and women of color and make sure that they're leading the movement so that things will change.
Oh, and what I want to say about this is the activist life is that even though I'm like just stepping into it, I've received a lot of backlash already, like for bringing women of color speak out to Garfield, and in general, just like speaking up about now my more radical thoughts to my white guy friends who constantly oppress me. And it hurts a lot. It's really emotionally taxing to have to explain racism to people or just to argue your thoughts when you feel like either you're invalid or that there's just a ton of people with more power than you. But the thing is, with activism, there's a lot of community and there's a lot of love. And so it's okay because even though you're hurt, you have a place to go to and you have people that understand you as well.
And so this invitation is to step into decolonizing our minds and our heart, and the system, it domesticates humans, it domesticates plants, and domesticates animals. And so the single active is actually slowing that down and reconnecting with ourselves. All right, thank you.
Okay, so break.